Bitcoin without internet. But it's technically not without internet. I would say it's internet minimized. But we have Elaine Ou, Dr. Adam back from Blockstream, Rodolfo Novak again from Coinkite, and Richard Myers from GoTenna. Please welcome them to the stage. OK, so we actually have a special announcement to make. So I'll kick it over to Richard to talk about something very cool that's happening right now.
Thanks, Samson. So I'm proud to announce that we've completed a project that will integrate the GoTenna mesh radio system with the Blockstream BlockSat system. So it's pretty exciting. So it's called TXTenna, and what it'll allow you to do is it'll allow anybody to send a signed Bitcoin transaction from a off-grid full node that's receiving blockchain data from the BlockSat, and then relay it over the GoTenna mesh network. And not just signed transactions, but also API data, which is pretty cool. And I want to thank everybody at Blockstream who's made this possible. It's been great to work with you guys, and especially Dan, who had very patiently worked on the versions testing. And if you're interested in more information, please go to the Blockstream site. There's a blog post about it by Dan Williams. And also, you can go to txtenna.com. There's more information about it. Thanks.
So
maybe Adam wants to say something too.
So I particularly like the way that they've integrated the Blockstream satellite API. So I gave an example in my presentation about people can send any kind of data, text data or small message data through the API paid for with Lightning, and that arrives on the sort of Bitcoin full node software that processes the satellite analog data. And so the TXTenna software looks at the received application data and also automatically relays the application data through the TXTenna network. So not only are you able to send Bitcoin transactions, but you're able to relay the satellite API data through the mesh network. So it would be a way to, for example, relay news or information in a sort of emerging market scenario where there's a small amount of infrastructure built up around a full node to send information through the satellite network, through the mesh network onto other equipment. So that's pretty cool.
Thanks.
All right, well, we'll get started with the panel. So show of hands from the audience. Who here has a GoTenna?
Awesome.
Okay. Who here has successfully connected to the Blockstream satellite? Ooh. Anyone here have a ham radio license? Okay, we have some work to do. I guess maybe starting at the end with Richard, like maybe can you describe like who was this built for? Who like well you're building TXTenna, but who needs TXTenna mesh network?
Yeah, so there's a couple of places where this could be used. I mean, if you think about like being in an off-grid scenario, so you might be in your cabin out in the woods, and you don't have an internet connection, but you still want to do some sort of commerce, say, this would allow you to send Bitcoin transactions over the mesh network and have it relay through other mesh devices that would get you to the internet. I mean, the other scenario would be in places where there's censorship. If you were in that sort of scenario, then this would allow you to not have to connect and give up your identification to be connected to the internet, because it would sort of route through a mesh of sort of anonymizing mesh relays. So there's sort of both privacy and also just resiliency are the two motivations why somebody might want to do this.
Rodolfo?
I mean, so we do a few different things that are related to both privacy and decentralization of Bitcoin. One of them is OpenDime, right? So it's like sneakernet style Bitcoin. You load it up and you can put it in a pigeon and send it somewhere. And it's quite fascinating because you can use Blockstream feed to check the device it's actually loaded, right? And the other thing is the PSBT new standard for partially signed Bitcoin transactions. We're a big pusher on that. And though it really facilitates doing this sort of decentralized, easy coordination of wallets and signing. One interesting thing about PSBT is that the Bitcoin wallet doesn't have to know which hardware wallet you're using anymore. So you don't have to ever plug your hardware wallet in a computer so you can have it fully air-gapped. But what's nice is that, say you have a multi-sig, one person can sign offline on their hardware wallet. He can load the partially signed transaction to the microSD card, and then he can use that same pigeon, send it over. He can sign the transaction, and then send it to, say, the third person to sign the transaction too, and then one of them would broadcast it. And at no point you needed internet or a computer to do this. It's kind of like remarkable. Like this standard really helps.
So I think there are lots of things that we have aspirations for the Blockstream satellite to help with. One is general resilience and robustness. So I mentioned you have the situation where you can have network splits. So you can be disconnected from the internet for political reasons or for infrastructure reasons. Another one is and it's important for Bitcoin's security model that there is global visibility of a single network, particularly if a country with a lot of mining were to get segregated temporarily from the rest of the network. So that's one kind of use to having independent connectivity. It's useful for any Bitcoin business, actually, generally, to have multiple internet connections, particularly if you're in mining, because if you lose an internet connection, you lose money very quickly as a miner, because you can't mine. So you can potentially mine over the satellite. It's good for privacy for power users that you can participate as a full node without advertising that to the Bitcoin peer-to-peer network. It's completely passive. The dish you have pointing at the satellite is also capable of receiving satellite TV, so even the direction it's pointing in doesn't really tell anybody that's looking at it what's going on. And I think it's also very interesting for sort of reducing the cost of participating in the Bitcoin network. So there are some sites that try to geolocate and map Bitcoin full nodes, and there are some countries that have like one node in the whole country and things like that. So in areas of Africa and other emerging market locations. And part of that is because the internet is expensive there in real terms, so it's more expensive than it is here or in Europe or in developed countries. And also the average salary is lower, so in real terms it's very expensive, and so consequently they often can't afford the amount of bandwidth to receive a full node, to receive all the data for a full node. But they will typically have smartphones, feature phones, and internet, just less bandwidth than that. So being able to receive the large amount of data over the satellite is actually very cost effective for that purpose. And then you can use some of the other technologies like radio technologies, LoRa, and ham radio, and mesh networks to fill in infrastructure around those and share also GPRS or other internet links for the smaller amount of data involved in sending transactions.
So if people were to set up, say, a seasteading colony out in the middle of the ocean and they don't want to rely on an existing internet exchange point, could they conceivably cobble together different Bitcoin without internet technologies and actually actively participate in Bitcoin?
I think we've achieved that now. So Bitcoin decoupled money from a central actor who was a validator, right? And I think the last barrier really was getting off the internet too, at least as a possibility. It doesn't mean we're not going to use the internet every day. It's kind of like we're not going to stop going to Starbucks and using a credit card either. But it's very comforting, and it's important to know that we're able to and to keep on sort of expanding on that capability to do transactions like from, say, remote locations. And again, you can now bring Bitcoin to places where people are less fortunate or have extremely bad regimes. and bypass those censorship models.
So how easy is it to cut off someone who is depending solely on, say, a satellite or a local mesh network?
It's very hard.
What do you mean, cut them off? You mean, I guess if you're thinking about just the mesh network itself, you would have to jam the mesh network somehow if you're trying to prevent people from communicating that way. I suppose that's true for any radio technology,
yeah, so
but not easy to do, I think.
With HF, so lower frequencies, it's extremely hard to pinpoint somebody because the same mechanism that helps you talk to somebody on the other side of the planet is the ionosphere. So essentially you're just bouncing radio signals off the sky and back down. It's like good luck trying to find where that person was. Another thing with mesh nets is that, like GoTenna, they're half a watt, right?
Yeah, very low power. Yeah.
Very modern countries have ways of trying to pinpoint locations where radio signal is coming out. That's how they send missiles into people. When you have low power and it's a moving target, it becomes very hard. Right? That's why a soldier's manpack for radio is very low power. They don't want them to be seen from satellites or other.
So, I think for the portable devices, the other benefit is they are, as well as low power, they're broadcasting infrequently because they're just sending a transaction that's quite small. And for the satellite, it has a different characteristic, which is its broadcast, so you don't even know, there's no client footprint or radio signature of who's receiving it. So you can't really selectively, disrupt access to satellite service on one spot on the ground without really, trying to disconnect the whole satellite or something like that.
So it sounds like, but ultimately, any of these technologies will need a relay point to transmit information back onto the actual internet. So given that, how does this change Bitcoin's trust model? If we're in a mesh network, are we trusting like Blockstream? Or if we're using satellite, are we trusting Blockstream?
With the satellite specifically, surprisingly, the answer is no. And it's because of a subtle reason, which is the Bitcoin blockchain is all authenticated data. So all the transactions are signed. When you run a full node, you verify them. And also, when you connect to the Bitcoin peer-to-peer network, how do you trust what random untrusted peers on the internet are sending you? For the same reason that you're able to verify it. So I think one thing you can do to help yourself is to try to spot check some of it with other information sources. But you can do that for extremely low bandwidth costs. Just receiving a block header over SMS once in a while will be enough to tell you that you're looking at the right chain, like you've cross-checked it with somebody else.
And I guess you can double-check Blockstream's satellite feed from sort of like a bunch of methods, right? You can have, say, a radio transmitter putting out compressed blocks or block headers, and you can check those against the Blockstream feed. If they were trying to cheat, you can also check the difficulty on those blocks to make sure the difficulty is high. If it drops, well, there's something funny going on.
Right.
So, there's also about almost 200 countries in the world, right? So it's unlikely that there will be a coordination of all these nations to sort of block the internet everywhere, right? We can't even coordinate to solve sort of world hunger.
I think there's also an aspect to it that's even if not everybody is running these alternative last mile connections, just knowing that they exist makes it less likely that a government or a large company might try to create this sort of attack because they know they can't completely control just the ISPs in a country or just the satellite uplinks. There's going to be multiple. If people can get information from multiple sources, then you hopefully can avoid that attack, even if not everybody has access to it.
We have a bunch of examples. Like you look at the Turkish last the protests there. People were, rebroadcasting tweets over SMS. No, sorry, that was Tahrir Square. People were using SMS to then get to somebody, and then they got blocked. Then they had call-in services where you could dictate a message for somebody else to tweet for you. And then you have, the balloons that go to North Korea with, USBs full of South Korea soap opera. Information wants to be free, and it's becoming, substantially cheaper to make sure you are not blocked.
Okay, so it sounds like people with different streams of information access can use this redundancy to cross-check and make sure, and route around censorship resistance. But one thing with Bitcoin is there are some security assumptions that assume all nodes are receiving information pretty quickly. Like the synchronization has to be much faster than like the proof of work solve rate. So if people are using many different forms of access to get this information and they're receiving blocks, say, at different times, could this open up the network to, say, a reorg attack or a partition?
It's, I mean, because the satellites are in geostationary orbit, there is a few hundred milliseconds round trip just to get data through the satellite due to the speed of light. But it's not that much worse than, going around the globe on regular internet links, which are probably more like two-thirds speed of light plus switching time. So it's not that much worse. I think your best defense against getting partitioned is to have redundant connectivity. So if the satellite's one form of connectivity, you can have tethering with a smartphone's another one, and a fixed internet line. So it's about sort of being prepared. And the ability to send data, you can also get bidirectional internet service. So there's something called Iridium Go, which is a battery-powered box that provides you with internet service, which is incredibly slow. It's like enough for text messages. It's 2400 baud. But that works globally and on anywhere that an Iridium sat phone would work. And there's another type of higher speed, 384 kilobits by HughesNet, which is a sort of laptop-sized thing that you point at the satellite approximately, and then you get another Wi-Fi, which provides bidirectional internet. So if somebody is operating a mining pool in a remote location, they could continue to operate that even if half of the continent's internet was out, for example. So that kind of redundancy is interesting to have for a geopolitically uncertain world, I guess.
Or Richard, what about with like remote mesh networks? How do they ensure that they're both? How would a remote mesh network ensure that it's receiving information from the actual blockchain?
Well, what we have implemented now isn't going to be a receiver. It's not going to rebroadcast the blockchain itself. So that's why it's such a good match with the BlockSat, which is really good at high bandwidth downloading of data. So the place I could see that coming into play with the mesh is, I mean, this is just a hypothetical, but let's say you had a miner and maybe they had a BlockSat to get information, but then they found a block and they wanted to get it out as quick as possible, and the internet was down or something like that. I could see something like a mesh network, because it's such a small amount of information that has to go out. It's very easy to send that out over a mesh and get it out there. Now, I think you're talking about timing as an issue as well. And if timing is an issue, you probably wouldn't want to rely on a mesh network to have that very fast connection. But if it was like the only connection you had, it would actually, it's better to have something than nothing. But I think you don't imagine the whole world running on one mesh technology, one radio mesh technology. It's going to be probably a hierarchy of technologies. You might have a local mesh to get it to some satellite uplink or to some high-speed fiber that does work. So you're getting across a border to where there is high-speed internet. So I think it's really more of a last-mile technology.
I think it's also important to remember that most people don't need fast Bitcoin. I mean, miners have a speed problem because it's a race to show your new block. But aside from miners, your coins have already been likely validated multiple times, right? So you're spending a UTXO, a coin that's already been validated. So there really is no speed problem there. You can take your time to send that out. The receiver can take their time and go through multiple hops to double check that the transaction was valid. It's not like it's a very rushed line at Starbucks in the morning and you're really using your ham radio there trying to get your coffee fast.
So, I mean, I think it's, for a miner, they have two latency requirements. One is to see new blocks very quickly, and the other one is to announce their block quickly, because being slow on either of those will increase their orphan rate and then reduce their profitability. But surprisingly, it should be possible to be fairly efficient while mining on the satellite, because even with a slow uplink or just an SMS or an Iridium Go, which is SMS-like speed, take a couple of seconds to send hundreds of bytes, because you could basically receive block proposals over the satellite message API. So it would just be, the block is already known, and then all you're broadcasting when you find the block is just the counters, basically. This is my public key for my payout. This is the nonce and the extra nonce, and all of that can fit in something small as the size of an SMS message. So the line of flight time to send an SMS message worth of data is a lot lower on a 2400 baud connection. If you actually had to send, the whole block, of course it would take minutes just because of the data rate.
Okay, so if an exchange were to get hacked and maybe want to bribe miners to begin a reorg, could Blockstream Satellite be used as, say, a pinning mechanism?
I mean, it wasn't envisaged as that, but I think one feature that people became aware of that's been around for a long time is something that Luke Dasher did, which is to do with BFG Miner, which is the mining software for operating a miner. And typically when you operate a miner, you put in a couple of pool addresses. One, the primary, and the second one is a backup in case the pool goes offline, because you don't want your miner to be not mining. And it turns out he had a feature in there, or he has a feature, which looks at the first one, and if it starts to go backwards, like if it starts to mine something at a lower height than it previously mined, he takes that as a sign that something's wrong and switches to the other pool. And so, that kind of auto switching could be interesting because it's another of those things where if you want to be a participant in the network, you should make an economic decision where you're aware of the factors. And if you're operating a miner, you're an economic actor, but if you're not looking at what your miner is doing, you're just relying on a pool to make a policy, that's a centralizing risk. So by having something that automatically switches if something changes, you're defaulting to not accepting policy changes. And I guess if the second one failed, maybe there needs to be some more software that alerts you that something strange is happening. Because if more people were independently mining, or more mining equipment was alerting its owner if something strange happens, then it becomes something where the wider community of investors and miners are taking part in the decisions.
Okay, so Rodolfo and also Richard, I mean, the network technologies you guys describe are kind of like ad hoc networks where in order for a new person to join, there already needs to be a number of people running the network. So how do you incentivize, or how do you envision incentivizing participants to be running these networks even when they're not actively transacting?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say one thing that Danielle Perdomo, our founder, said that was interesting is that you can get some inspiration from Bitcoin because it's a protocol that incentivizes its own use. And when you think about, mesh networks have been around for a long time. Why haven't they caught on? Why haven't they spread? And we think that, in a way, if you look at Bitcoin, you can get some inspiration for how a protocol can inspire its own use. and that maybe giving some sort of an incentive like that to people who run mesh nodes would be a way, even if it isn't a lot of money, just like the Lightning Network. I mentioned this before, that the people run the Lightning Network, they don't, it's sure you can make a little bit of money on it, but just having that incentive, that little trickle of value is something that will inspire people to go to a lot of trouble to run a node. And there may be some approach like that that could work for a mesh network of different kinds too.
I described in my talk, it's fairly easy to incentivize, to pay somebody to do something for you in Bitcoin, right? So, you can just add an extra output to your transaction, and as they broadcast that transaction, they literally get paid because their payment is embedded in your transaction. Right, so there's not even a way for them to try to cheat you or split that or anything. It's part of it. And if there is value there, if there is demand there, people will do it. The same way people run Wi-Fi hotspots that you pay money for. It's fairly simple to incentivize relay.
Okay, so this morning we heard a lot, or I guess not really this morning, but earlier today we heard a lot from people working on Lightning. So could any of these technologies be applicable to layer 2 networks, or could Lightning feasibly run on any of these?
Well, it's something that we certainly thought about because of the availability of bidirectional satellites. I described HughesNet and Iridium Go, and you're really in a quite extreme high latency, low bandwidth situation in some of those. And so Lightning is designed to be fairly bandwidth efficient, but there may be specific things that can be optimized for the sort of network behavior characteristics. Lightning anyway is an online transaction. You can't generally receive if you're not online, whereas Bitcoin, that's not the case. You can be offline and receive later. So I think some of these use cases might benefit from the ability to receive while offline, because if they're sort of ruggedized, mobile, off-grid, and you have to have some kind of continuously on connectivity to receive, that may not suit your use case. But anyway, with Lightning specifically, it's source routed. So when you connect a Lightning node, it tries to download a full map of the Lightning nodes in the network, so then it knows how to route to anywhere else in the network. And periodically, it will get updates as new nodes join and leave. So yeah, it's fairly low bandwidth. It is a bit interactive for some of these network connectivity situations, but it can probably be optimized in certain ways as well.
I believe I was with you, right, that I exchanged Lightning invoice over radio.
We did, and we kind of cheated by coordinating it over the internet first.
So, data is data, right? You can send any data if you have a pipe. Now, if this pipe goes through many turns, it just takes a little longer, but it's totally doable. I mean, another thing I was thinking is that you could have a liquid, say a liquid-based bank in a small village that, say this village is like under bad weather and is in a mountain, and really it's just a disaster to get data in and out. You could run a little liquid-based bank there where you offer some credit and you have some form of accounting, and then every time the sky opens up, you get a satellite feed, you can sort of do some consolidation of those transactions. So you could literally have sort of like a federated sort of Bitcoin, pseudo-Bitcoin village running that way, and that would be L2.
So with the high-frequency radio interchange you did, isn't one of the characteristics of Lightning that you have to maintain some kind of TCP connection for the duration?
Yeah. So the higher the bandwidth, the higher the frequency, the worse it gets, essentially, right? So, when you get into microwave, like satellite feeds, you have to be a direct, line of sight, but that's why you have to point your antenna and really aim at the satellite, as opposed to HF radio, where essentially you just, bounce the signal into the sky and it sort of, goes everywhere. You kind of aim a little bit, but it's pretty much into the air. And sort of like that's sort of the issue is like you always have to pick, you know, do I want more bandwidth with more constraints, or am I doing lower bandwidth with less constraints? With LoRa is pretty cool.
Yeah, but if you look at, I mean, you're talking about the Lightning Network, if you look at what is being exchanged, it's really you're just exchanging signatures. I mean, there's a lot of other things going on to make this work, but at the end of the day, you're just exchanging signatures. And so some of the technologies that are coming out sort of down the road that are being talked about, things like Schnorr that maybe allow you to perhaps aggregate signatures, things like that. Even L2, I think, offers some opportunities to make lower bandwidth versions. Now, it might not be the exact sort of current protocol of Lightning, but there could be some low bandwidth alternatives to, low bandwidth versions, I should say, of Lightning that maybe would work over HF or would work over mesh. And the nice thing about, you know, just to take it to like what I know with mesh is that there, you know, mesh, Lightning as it currently works is a mesh. It's like Bitcoin, it's a flat network. But it's an overlay network on a more or less centralized internet. But if you could do something like Lightning where both the payment network and the communication network is running at sort of the same, on the same, same mesh network, is basically one and the same. There's advantages to that, I think, you know, because now your nodes they're rewarded not just for sending a payment along to the next node, they're actually also paid for the communication part of that, you know, the wireless part.
It doesn't really matter what kind of radio you use. They all run at light speed. That's the cool thing about radio, you know, your phone or whatever is the device, it's all light speed. So the speed is the same. Now the bandwidth on them for, say, Lightning is actually not that much for a single transaction. I mean, we were using a very, like, it wasn't like the greatest bandwidth protocol for that, but like if you're using PSK 1000R like I was with Peter on the other example, you know, you could have sent, you know, like essentially a megabyte in just a couple minutes, I think. So it's kind of doable. We're almost reaching a point that if it got really bad, you could almost broadcast blocks via HF.
Okay, so we asked around earlier at the very beginning of the panel, and not that there wasn't widespread audience adoption when it comes to like radio or mesh or even satellite. So what do you think is the biggest hurdle in getting more people to actively participate in non-internet Bitcoin?
I think it's partly ease of use. In the sense that we've had, like at Blockstream, we had quite a lot of requests for, oh, can I buy a kit? Because what's there is just an instruction, and it's kind of complicated, right? You have to find an LNB with these characteristics, and people will send us emails saying, do you mean this one? So they really just want to pay money and get the parts. And also they want the setup to be easy. So pointing a satellite dish is kind of a little bit of an art form. It has to be positioned quite accurately, and there are tools you use to do that. So it's a little bit of a learning experience, but you can also, you know, just get a satellite installer to come and set it up for you. So ease of use and just being able to pay Bitcoin somewhere and have equipment arrive is one thing, and also use cases that connect things together. So, you know, you heard at the beginning of the panel about the GoTenna mesh network connecting into the full node software on the satellite, so that's one type of connectivity. So having things plugged together is important, and we're often relying on third-party developers. And you know, there are some interesting projects in different emerging markets where people are working with mesh networks. So hopefully people will build more things on top of the infrastructure.
I was just going to say, you know, one thing that I think GoTenna shows is that, you know, mesh technology, if it was just done by amateurs, is actually kind of a hard hobby maybe to get into, but doesn't mean these things can't be made into a consumer product. I mean, I think that's also like what Adam's saying, is that it may start as sort of a hobbyist thing, but it can be turned into a consumer product. So I think that's one important lesson to learn there. And also, I think the other thing is that people do need a use for it, and maybe the use is going to be different in different parts of the world. There may be places that do have, you know, problems with connectivity, or like Adam said, very expensive internet, you know, data rates. And I think you're going to see adoption in those places before you see maybe adoptions in places that already have low, relatively low cost 4G.
I mean, we already see this, disaster relief is essentially a bunch of amateur radio crazy people who just sort of help out, right? It is, the learning curve is a little bit high, and it's like complicated stuff because, we like the buttons, right? As many buttons as possible. But these things could be packaged by, programmers have a lot of time in their hands to into something that's like, here's a parts list. You just buy this stuff and you load this image into your Raspberry Pi, and like boom, you now have a relay system. I think because we don't see a lot of need yet for these solutions, like in the real world, there's nobody really sort of reaching out and saying, I really need this yesterday. We haven't seen a lot of these solutions being sort of made easy. It's kind of like Linux, right? On the beginning, it was very hard. You had to know what you were doing. Now you just get an image from the internet, and boom, it runs on your computer. It really is just a need and the time to develop easy solutions.
So, the other thing to bear in mind, I think there are two flavors, right? One is something that starts as hobbyist because it's not very easy to use. So Linux might be an example of that, where in the early days you had to compile it from all source and things like that. And nowadays it's on all smartphones. Well, most smartphones are Linux-based. And the other one is the hardware cost factor. So, devices sometimes start out as like a James Bond like status symbol. The guy has a satellite phone and he carries it around or something, right? So, maybe some devices like that do interesting survivability things for Bitcoin, but cost $500 or $1,000 would sell surprisingly well in this market, and that would provide the funding to reduce the cost in iterations. So it would go through an adoption path like cell phones have, where there are now more cell phones than computers, basically.
I think it's very interesting because there is a very selfish motive for any Bitcoiner really to do some of this stuff out of their own pockets, right? It's kind of like running a full node. What, do you need to run a full node to do, second-class citizen Bitcoin? No, you don't. If you want to be a first-class citizen, you run your own node. But the thing is, if you are invested in Bitcoin, right, and you have some of your wealth sitting in Bitcoin, it's going to be in your interest to help the Bitcoin network remain resilient and decentralized. And that includes maybe running a satellite dish on top of your house, or having a HF relay node, or having a bunch of GoTennas distributed in your town. If you have a voluntary system, all the solutions are going to be kind of voluntary too. There is no government mandated Bitcoin instruction of the things you must do in order to partake in this. I think it's important to understand that.
And you can think of like merchants, for example, like maybe, obviously we're enthusiasts, we're going to do it, but once you start to see a Bitcoin economy develop, these are the people who probably will be, they want to continue to do commerce even when the power's out. So they're going to look into these resiliency measures probably before your home user would. So I think, I think that's going to be sort of how things like that get bootstrapped.
I think the circular Bitcoin economy, like the internal Bitcoin economy, is also not as big yet as it has potential to grow. And the cost is a factor as well in emerging markets. Like things that we would take for granted living in a developed country are more expensive. Like the equipment's more expensive, the internet is more expensive even in direct terms, but like way more expensive in local terms. And people in emerging markets have, on the face of it, extremely good use cases for Bitcoin as a currency that we lack, because while we complain about inflation on, the most major currencies have lost 99% of their value over a 100-year time frame, the pain point per year being within 2 to 5% is not the average person in the public. That's not their main problem that they're reacting to. But in emerging markets where they have hyperinflation or currency devaluations and replacements and things like that, they actually have a very good use case for Bitcoin, and you see that in some countries. So to make things cheaper and easier to use and more resilient to unstable infrastructure is actually very interesting. I mean, there are literally billions of people who could use this if the technology could be made to scale and be reliable. You know, sort of people with operating roadside kiosk in an area with unstable infrastructure could be a pretty interesting use case for Bitcoin.
I mean, if there is a market, somebody's going to fill it.
Yeah.
So if China were to nuke us tomorrow and we nuke them back and all the internet exchange points were totally annihilated, is it conceivable that people could cobble together their decentralized technologies and rebuild the Bitcoin network?
For sure.
I think the Bitcoin network would continue to operate through this event, surprisingly. I mean, the hash rate would go down, and
people are mining Bitcoin by hand on like pencil and paper.
Well, I mean, I'm assuming that there is some, you know, mining in the Swiss Alps in a bunker or in New Zealand or somewhere remote to this, and that those pockets would continue to be cross-connected, potentially using satellite equipment. So the people who have the insurance policy are the people who've, you know, the enthusiasts who have played with the technology, basically.
I think there is a difference between being over and being disrupted, right? So, you know, if you have a major country sort of cutting its pipes to the rest of the world, you know, of course it's going to be disruptive, right? You could see the Bitcoin price, you know, have a massive fluctuation, and then you're going to have issues getting data in and out. But, you know, like any sort of catastrophe, you know, it takes a few days and you sort things out, you know, and you will find a way. You just get close to the border and use a walkie-talkie, and you can get a link that way. And then you can use a bunch of GoTennas connected to that, distributing the data to the rest of the country. And then you can have some, you know, Wi-Fi high-power antennas pointed into the country. And it's just that the spectrum is so big for radio, that like it's be essentially impossible for them to block everything.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is one of the interesting aspects of Bitcoin, is a lot of what we do, you know, a lot of the way the protocol is designed is to be minimal, and the side effect of that is it is possible to put it on a memory stick or broadcast it via broadband Wi-Fi. You know, and so these things are done for security reasons, but they have this nice effect that it means you can use different communication technologies that wouldn't be available if you had a lot more data being broadcast, like, you know, 2-second blocks or whatever. You know, it's achievable to do with alternative communication methods.
Now, can you imagine if we lower the block size to, say, 500 to 300 kilobytes? I mean, that would be awesome. We can totally just broadcast Bitcoin blocks over radio, and the problem is completely solved.
You heard it here first.
All right, so we only have a few minutes left. Are there any other internet-less Bitcoin technologies that you guys are excited about that maybe aren't developed yet or in the works?
Pigeon Post?
That's pretty exciting.
Let's see.
I mean, I guess, like, there's like enough ideas out there. It's just sort of having people put in the time to make them easy to use is the thing that I want most. You know, having a Blockstream satellite dish box that sits below your TV. You know, you just get that, you plug it in, and then boom, you have block data coming in, being broadcasted around. Or, you know, you have your, like maybe a little box that sits in your roof, and that's how you get paid to relay transactions. These things just need to be made either into businesses or just be made easy because somebody has a lot of free time.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot more things that could be built using existing spectrums and digital communication formats with satellites and other that could be packaged into equipment and products. There's a lot more potential, so many more interesting things could be done.
All right, one more minute. Any parting thoughts? Anything you can say to get these guys to feel really motivated to go home and set up a satellite receiver, or
get an amateur radio license?
I mean, I think the interesting thing for running a full node behind a satellite for probably most of our audience is the privacy it gives you, that you're not even connected to the Bitcoin network from the perspective of your ISP or any other nodes on the Bitcoin network or the taint tracing services that try to spy on the network. So you really have kind of much more private network participation, which is pretty cool, and it's kind of fun project to set up.
Richard, why should they go buy a GoTenna?
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about the GoTenna is it is a consumer item. This isn't something you need any real special knowledge to use. You can download an Android app and you can play with it. You know, you can actually, it's a consumer device. So I encourage you, if you're interested, you don't always have to use it for Bitcoin. You can tell your family that you're getting it for hiking, but you can also use it for Bitcoin. So.
And people should get a ham radio license because they can broadcast to North Korea, right?
Why would you not have one?
Yeah.
I mean, it is like super cool.
Okay, awesome. So that's all we have time for. Thanks, you guys.
Thanks, Emily.